I want to begin this morning by telling you a story, an experience that happened to me a few years ago. And it was just in the evening, an evening like many of us would have had, and my wife and I were just before dinner time. And she said to me, "Can you go down to the grocery store and pick up some milk? It's the only thing we need. That's the main thing. And we need some other stuff, but don't worry about it. I'll do a shop in a couple days. I'll get everything else. But if you could just go and do that one thing, that'd be great." So I thought that's great. And we go through a lot of milk in my house. We've got 3 little kids. And so I grabbed my son Benjamin, and we jumped in the car and we went down to No Frills, which is about 2 kilometers from my house. So we got in there, but of course, as soon as I get in, I see a bunch of things. The first thing I see is bananas, because the produce section is right by the door. And I think that's great. Laura doesn't want me to get this stuff, but I'm here. This is going to be a favor to her, a favor to our family, so this is great. So I got some bananas, of course, but then at the end of the aisle, I see there's cheese and there's yogurt, and we need yogurt. So I go down and get some of that too. And I go a little further down and I see the notorious aisle number 7, and that's where the chips are. So I go get a bag of salt and vinegar chips, and I come back, and so I've got a few extra things. I come through the checkout, and Benjamin and I get there, we pay and head back to the parking lot and back home. It's great. And so I walk in the door, and my wife greets me, and I just feel really good about myself because I've got all these things, and I say, honey, I got bananas and I got yogurt, and I got some chips even for tonight. It's going to be great. And she says, that's great, honey, but what about the milk? And of course, I'd forgotten the main thing. That's my sole purpose to go there, was to get milk, and I forgot it. That was the main thing, and I neglected it. And as I was thinking about this message, and I was thinking about that story, I realized how true is that for so many different aspects of our life, so many different areas of our life. We forget about the main thing, and we get distracted by 100 lesser things. If you think about your work, quite often when we go into a work situation, we have ideals. We want to be a certain person of character or integrity in our work. And, we get distracted by 100 lesser things, and we forget the main thing. Or maybe it's in our family life, in our relationship. And, we have these ideals. We go into it. We have the main thing in mind. We want to have relationships of trust. We want to have dinner time together. We want, having those special family moments. And then we get distracted by all this busyness and all these different things, and we forget about the main thing. I think it happens in our faith too. We have these ideals. We know about God's kingdom come, His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We want to become more like Christ. We want to be people of faith, hope, and love. We know that God is renovating the world, and we want to be a part of that. And then we get distracted by 100 lesser things, and we end up having these little squabbles or conversations or this stuff that we do that we know deep down isn't kingdom work. We get distracted by all this other stuff, and we don't focus on the main thing. A book I read recently called Captivology by Ben Parr, he talks about how when we're at our workstation or computer or something, and when something distracts us, it takes the average person 23 minutes to get back on task. So, you check Facebook, or an email comes in, or the phone rings, or someone comes to the door trying to sell you something, and it takes people on average up to 23 minutes to get back on task. And that's just a small thing, but I think it's also true for all those other things. We get distracted and we lose focus of the main thing in the no frills of our life. I just have this fundamental conviction, and it's this: we don't need more time or less tasks, but clearer priorities. We don't need more time. We don't need less tasks. We need clearer priorities. I think that's true in every single aspect of our lives. And I think this is helpful to think about now as we start a new year. Maybe we've been in a rut in a certain area of our life. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's a family or relationship. Maybe it's in our walk with Christ, with whatever it is. Maybe we're in a rut, and we need to get back to those priorities and that focus. So now is a great time of year to think about these things. But it takes discipline. It takes setting priorities for us. Devotional writer Max Lucado he's so poetic with his words, and this is how he says it. He says, Jesus said no to good things to say yes to the right things. Jesus said no to good things to say yes to the right things. And I love that because there's so many good things in our life. There's things that can take our time and our energy, and many of those things are good, but they might not be the right things for us. So sometimes we have to say no to good things to say yes to the right things. So my hope is that today we can focus on some of those good things as we look at a passage from Proverbs chapter 3. Now, the reason we want to do this, Scripture is inspired by God, and so we can get wisdom and insight for living when we look at the passages of Scripture. And part of the great thing about Proverbs is that this particular passage in Proverbs is it's very familiar to us. Now, it's very familiar, so I like some of these familiar passages in the Bible because it usually means that people through history and generations have earmarked these passages and they're important. They've got incredible wisdom, but because they're so familiar, sometimes we stop hearing them. It's like the Lord's Prayer. We'll say it, many of us have learned it from when we were very young, but we say it so often we don't actually hear what it's saying anymore. How often have we said the Lord's Prayer and then by the time we're done, we realize we haven't been thinking about it at all. We've been thinking about laundry or something else. So some of these familiar passages are good to return to because they're priority passages. They help us focus on the main thing and not be distracted by a bunch of other things. So that whole, some of these familiar passages, I'm reminded of a friend of mine who, when I was growing up, he lived close to some train tracks. And it was one Saturday morning and we were playing, and it was probably after hockey practice or something. And we were there and we were playing on the floor of his bedroom, and I heard this sound get louder and louder and louder. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "What's what?" I said, "What's that sound?" And he said, "What sound?" And so I said, "That sound." And so he stood up and he listened, and only when he really paid attention to realize, he said, "Oh, that's the train." And there was this sound of this whistle blowing, and the ground was actually shaking a little bit. And he was just so used to it that he didn't hear it anymore. And I think that is true with some of these fundamental passages from Scripture. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 3. So a little bit of background to the book of Proverbs, written thousands of years ago. And this particular section from Proverbs is wisdom being passed down from a father to his son. So you can think of it as wisdom being passed down from a parent to a child. And part of the reason why I love that, and part of the reason the book of Proverbs is so enduring, is because that's wisdom we can relate to. Information and wisdom and insight for living being passed down from generation to generation to generation. So that's a bit of the background to Proverbs. And as we go through it, I'll explain a few things as the verses come up. So chapter 3, verse 1. "My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart." So one quick word about the idea of a heart. So today we often think of heart as a place of emotions and feeling, and I understand that, but also in the biblical imagination, heart was also thought of as a place of thinking, as a place of cognition. So the heart is used in biblical language and biblical literature as a place where not only where we express feelings and emotion, but also thinking and how we process information. So it's really the essence of who we are, which is why the idea of a heart comes up time and time again. So on to verse 2. "For they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity." So the idea, as this father transmits this wisdom down to a child, it's not what brings us prosperity. It's not stuff. It's not things. It's not huge families. It's really what he's about to say. These ideas, this wisdom, this teaching. Goes on to verse 3. "Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart." So here he's identified two things: love and faithfulness. Themes that come up time and time again. And we can think of love in the sense of our outgoing care and concern and compassion for someone else. And loyalty and faithfulness, these words have a very close relationship in biblical language. So let love and faithfulness, bind them around your neck. So the first metaphor that's used is something that some of us can probably relate to. If you've got a pendant around your neck with a picture of a loved one. And the reason we do that is because we want it to be close to our heart, the center of our very being. I think of this even with the crosses that we wear around our neck. Sometimes we do that. It's because we want to remind ourselves of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. We want to think about God's victory over sin and death and evil, and the victory that God is winning through that whole process, and God's love and sacrifice for us. So we have it around our neck, not only so others can see it, but also because we ourselves want to be reminded and keep it close to our hearts. And then the metaphor gets extended in the next line, which is, write them on the tablet of your heart. It's beautiful. Sometimes you'll hear this passage in weddings, write it on the tablet of your heart. Recently, a friend of mine got the name of their grandmother tattooed on their arm. And this is because they just always wanted to actually carry around the name of their grandmother, just to be reminded of her love and the wisdom of things that she taught her. So she did that to literally be always walking around with that recollection, with that memory. And I think a similar thing is happening here with a metaphor that we tattoo these ideas of love and faithfulness on our hearts. So they're always with us and carrying them around with us. And then in verse 4, then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. So these first 4 verses are really kind of setting up this kind of core bit, and this is the familiar passage I was talking about, this core bit in verses 5 and 6. So here it is. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. So this is one of those familiar passages that I've mentioned. You've maybe even seen it on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt, or maybe it's underlined in your grandmother's Bible. You can sometimes see this in a Facebook meme or something. It is one of those passages which is so enduring and is so memorable. But like something like the Lord's Prayer, just because it's familiar doesn't mean we're always thinking about it. It's a priority passage, but we can still forget about it because it's so familiar. So trust in the Lord with all your heart. So that's a totality statement. Everything, it's a priority. It's not just with a portion of your heart on Sunday morning or a portion of your heart when you remember to say your prayers. The idea is always trust, believe, be loyal to, with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Some people have criticized this passage, saying it kind of reeks of anti-intellectualism, but that's really not what's happening. The idea is it's warning against arrogance. So when you think of that idea of leaning into something, if you lean totally on yourself, you're really just believing in yourself. So I love that metaphor, because when you lean on something, you're depending on that something to prop you up and to give you stability and security in your life. So the passage resolves in verse 6 and says, in all your ways acknowledge him, meaning acknowledge God, and he will make your paths straight. One of the verb here could also be translated, he will make your paths level. And the idea is that we're not going to be dealing with all those same obstructions and problems we've been having if we're acknowledging him and if we're trusting him, not just with a little bit of us, but with all of us. It's basically a priority statement. And so when the vertical gets priority, the horizontal gets perspective. So when the vertical gets priority, all those other things that we're dealing with get perspective. And so this is part of the reason why this is a helpful passage at the start of a new year, as we think about a new us and think about how we're acting and how we're living in the workplace or in our families or in our walk with Christ, however it is. We don't want that obstruction. We want to have that focus. And this doesn't just occur here in Scripture. It happens all over the place, this idea that if you give the vertical priority, the horizontal gets perspective, and you start to see a pattern that emerges. Happens in the 10 Commandments. The first 4 are about the vertical relationship. The last 6 are about a horizontal relationship. You get that first bit right, then the second bit falls into place. Happens in the Lord's Prayer. The first bit, our Father who art in heaven, it's about praise and seeking God's kingdom come, glorifying his name, and then it goes on to the horizontal relationships. Even in the greatest commandment, the first thing is love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, strength. The heart comes up again. It's a total statement. It's not saying, leave out your wallet, leave out what you do on the internet, leave out other aspects of your life. It's saying all of you. And when you do that right, all of a sudden, then you can love your neighbor as yourself, because that vertical has been given priority, and then the horizontal gets perspective. So what I'd like for us to do is to do a very practical experiment to train ourselves. Because I think if we're going to live out this idea from Proverbs in a practical way and be helped as we start a new year, we actually need to physically train ourselves to not get distracted by all the things, and to live this out, to trust the Lord with our heart, and to lean not on our own understanding. So I'm going to do a little project. It's called the jar experiment, or the jars of time. And some of you will have heard about this before. And I've done it at church before with the kids. And one of the things I've discovered is quite often the stuff that's helpful for kids is actually helpful for us, because we're forced to clarify our thinking and how we speak. And so it's helpful to us as adults as well. So here's how it works. This jar represents basically a day of your time. And these things that are in the jar represent different things that you do that take up bits of your time. So for example, these little marbles are small, so these aren't negative things, but these are just things that take up bits of your time nevertheless. So they represent, that extra email you have, maybe extra Facebook time, standing in front of the closet that extra 10 minutes, choosing something to wear, maybe that sitcom that you watch that isn't that funny, but you watch it anyway. These types of things. I'm not saying they're bad. It's just stuff that takes up time in our day that's represented in this jar. So then I've got some golf balls here, and golf balls, they're bigger. So these are more significant things that take up time, attention, and energy in your day. So we'll put them in. This represents like meal time, and this is rest. Represents school, work, important conversation with a friend who's struggling with something. These types of things. And so it's the jar's pretty much full. Now what I want to do is show you this rock, and this rock represents Christ. And we call Jesus our cornerstone, and Scripture refers to God as rock, sometimes the immovable, eternal. And what we find is when we do that, there's really not room for the rock in the jar, because we've done all this other stuff with our time, energy, but we haven't really prioritized Christ. We haven't trusted the Lord with all our heart. We've just kind of compartmentalized that part of our life. Okay, so let's try this a little bit differently with another jar and see what happens. So this jar is empty. So this represents, again, a day of your time, but we're going to try this experiment in a different order. We're going to take the rock and we're going to put the rock in first. So remember, this rock represents Christ, and so we're going to put that in first. So what I've got is I've still got these golf balls, the same amount of golf balls, same amount of marbles, and we're going to put them in again. We're going to put these in, and this represents that family time, that call with a friend who really needs you. This is work and rest. And so you think that, okay, is there going to be room for the marbles? Is there still going to be room for everything? Well, we're going to put them in and find out. So this is that extra phone call. Your Aunt Beatrice is calling you. You check into Twitter. You still watch that extra, sitcom. You're still, spending an extra 10 minutes in front of the mirror, choosing what you're going to wear. So put all that stuff in there. And what we find is that everything still fits. But the difference is that the rock is in there first. And what you find when you do this is when you prioritize your relationship with Christ and you kind of focus on that main thing at the start of each and every day, three things happen. The character, quality, and content of your day goes through the roof. It goes up. The character, quality, and content of your day goes through the roof. So what I'd like to do to actually train us in this idea and to actually do something very practically that we can all try, that actually trains us to actually live out this concept in our daily lives, is to give your first minute to God. Give your first minute to God before you even get out of the day. And what I mean by that is to put actually this into practice. Is before you even get out of bed, is just pray that first minute. And pray that God helps you do those things, that you trust in the Lord with all your heart. You're asking Him to do that. To lean not on your own understanding, that He makes your paths level, and you say a prayer, something to the effect of, God, please, direct my attention and energy. Help me not to be distracted by lesser pursuits. Let me focus on your kingdom today. Help me be focused on you and capture my attention, because attention directs direction. Put another way, what you pay attention to directs you. What you pay attention to directs you. So by doing something like this, we are focusing your attention, and what you'll find is you give God your first minute, all of a sudden, all the other minutes of your day become easier to bring in line with those main things, those main priorities and goals. Now, I don't want to claim authorship of that idea. I've heard it from other teachers and pastors, and perhaps most influential on me was a man in the congregation who passed away a little while ago. He was a minister in the Evangelical Church of Canada, and he was a catechist in the Presbyterian Church. But for the past couple years of his life, he hasn't been able to come to services. And so whenever I would go to visit him at the nursing home, he would always remind me, he'd say, I pray for you and your good wife every day before my feet hit the floor. And then when we had kids later on, he would say, I pray for you and your good wife and your 3 kids before my feet hit the floor. And he did that every single morning before he went out of bed. So I would like to invite all of you to do that same thing as we focus our attention, because we know what we pay attention to directs you, and to starting to give your first minute of the day to God. Because again, my fundamental conviction, if we're going to try to live out this idea from Proverbs 3 and hear it again for the first time, is that we don't need more time or less tasks, but clearer priorities. Give your first minute to God. I want to kind of bring it together with a true story I heard. A woman who lived in Belgium, was 67 years old, and she was going to a train station to pick up a friend of hers coming to her visit, and this train station was in Brussels, and it was 90 miles away. So she plugs it into her GPS, And that's all she did to find out where she was going. And she headed out on the highway, and she's driving along. You know, the time goes. 90 miles is a big trip, but it's not a huge trip. She was going along, and she thought, okay, maybe I should be getting close to, you know, the exit where I'm supposed to get off. And she was approaching it, and, you know, GPS wasn't saying anything, so she kept going. And you know what? Then she goes into the next town, and still no, GPS isn't saying anything. She keeps going and keeps going. Hours turn into hours, turn into hours, turn into hours, until suddenly the signs, like the language on the signs that she's seeing on the road, the language is different. And what happens? Well, she eventually drives into Croatia. And what happened is what was supposed to be a 90-mile trip turned into a 900-mile trip. She actually went on a trans-European adventure. Incredible story, and a local newspaper finds this out and asks her about it. And this is what she said. This was her response. How could it happen? She said, I was absent-minded, and so I kept putting my foot down. I was absent-minded, so I kept putting my foot down. Think about that for a second. Does that apply to you? Are we so absent-minded we just keep putting our foot down, and we're distracted by 100 lesser things in whatever version of no frills you are dealing with in your life? We don't need more time or less tasks, but clearer priorities. Here's what the passage says. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Let's focus on the main thing as we start a new year for whatever we're dealing with in our family or our work or in our walk with Christ. And let's put the rock in first and give your first minute to God.